The Great Fire of Rome, a story told by ashes and WHSPR. What if I told you that one of history's most famous villains might actually be innocent? That the story you know about Nero fiddling while Rome burned is almost certainly false? And that the real tragedy isn't just about fire and politics, but about how easily we choose our scapegoats? For a week, the heart of the known world burned. They say a single man was to blame. But what if we listen to the city itself, its wood and stone, its markets and alleys, its fears and its hopes? Tonight, Rome will tell you what happened. Chapter I. The city as a tion diabo extrum did not sleep in silence. It murmured. Timber beams pressed against timber walls. Tenements act high, fast, and cheap. Narrow lanes where a man could touch both sides with his fingertips. Roof lines tangled like kindling. Inside, small braziers ticked, kitchens flickered, workshops, SMOLDERED. Picture the Suburra district at midnight. 5 stories of apartments balanced above a bakery. The bakers' ovens cool slowly, their heat rising through wooden floors where families sleep. Above them, a weaver stores her threads. Above her, a scribe keeps his scrolls. At the top, beneath tiles that shift with every wind, a family of 6 shares, 2 rooms. Grain stores stood close to bakeries. Pitch and oil waited for the next day's work. In the leather quarter, hides hung beside torches. In the furniture district, sawdust gathered in corners where sparks might land. And through the night, watchmen vigils walked beats that were longer than their buckets were deep. The vigils carried hooks and axes, pumps that could draw from cisterns when cisterns were near. But water was heavy, and streets were narrow. And when fire moved faster than men could run, tools became memories of good intentions. None of this made fire certain, but it made fire a character in the city's story. Building codes existed and failed. Decrees demanded stone facing, but interiors stayed wood. The city grew too quickly for its own safety. Every empty lot became a building site. Every building site pushed higher, reaching for rent from tenants who could not afford better. Caesar had tried to limit building heights. Augustus had tried to widen streets, but Rome was hungry for space, and space was vertical, and vertical was wood stacked upon wood reaching towards sky. A shopkeeper shutters late on a July evening. The air is still and warm, holding the day's heat like a held breath. Inside his shop, amphorae of oil stand in neat rows. Bolts of cloth wait for morning customers. Above, his family sleeps in rooms that share walls with a blacksmith's forge. Cold now, but still radiating warmth into the night. A lamp kisses a curtain. A mouse rattles grain. We do not know the first spark's name. We only know how ready the city was to carry it. A city is a system, and this one ran hot. The Circus Maximus district, where our story begins, was particularly vulnerable. Here, beneath the shadow of the great racing stadium, shops crowded together like spectators fighting for the best view. The circus itself could hold 250,000 people. The shops that served them were built for speed and profit, not for safety. If not weather, then when and who would be blamed? Chapter 2. The rumors BG Iron reports say the fire began near the circus. Flames ran with the wind, jumped streets, found roofs stacked with summer kindling. Palaces and hovels alike learned that wood forgets who owns it. The fire started small, as fires do. A lamp overturned. An ember from a dying cooking fire. Perhaps a candle too close to stored cloth. The exact cause vanishes in the chaos of what followed, but the pattern was predictable. Fire found fuel, wind gave it direction, and the city's own structure became its accomplice. Within the first hour, the shops around the circus were burning. The flames climbed wooden stairs, followed corridors, burst through windows into the night air. Residents fled with what they could carry, sometimes nothing but their lives. Whispers run faster than fire. Soldiers are blocking the buckets, someone swears. They want it to spread. Another voice, the emperor sings while Rome burns. None of this is proven here, and yet all of it is believed somewhere. In times of disaster, rumors are how fear speaks. A woman sees soldiers in a street where fire approaches and thinks, why aren't they carrying water? A man watches a building collapse and wonders, was it pulled down by design? These questions have reasonable answers, but reasonable answers take time, and fear needs explanations now. The fire burned for a day, then 2, then a week. Each day brought new stories. Each story found eager ears. In the refugee camps that sprouted in gardens and public spaces, people shared more than food and shelter. They shared theories. Nero away at Antium. He opens the campus Martis and his gardens to refugees, arranges food at low prices, orders firebreaks houses torn down before flames can claim them. The emperor's response was, by the measures of his time, generous and swift. He threw open his own properties to house the displaced. He ordered grain to be sold below cost. He mobilized the vigils and organized citizen brigades to tear down buildings in the fire's path, creating breaks the flames could not cross. But even kindness carries questions when it comes from power. Why his gardens? Ask the displaced. Why food now? Ask the hungry who were hungry yesterday. Aid is help and it is theater. In trauma, even kindness sounds like an alibi. The emperor who opens his gardens to refugees is generous. The emperor who owns vast gardens while citizens live in wooden boxes is ... something else. Both can be true. Both shape how his actions are received by the 4th day. When the fire finally began to die, 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been completely destroyed. 7 more were damaged. Temples that had stood for centuries were ash. Libraries containing works that would never be written again were gone. The house where Augustus was born. Shrines to gods older than Rome itself gone. The rumor that Nero sang of Troy's burning becomes a melody history cannot stop humming. It may be slander. It may be memory's way of making a villain visible. The story goes that Nero, watching the city burn from his palace, recited verses from the Aeneid about the fall of Troy, dressed in stage costume, playing the lyre, performing grief instead of feeling it. The image is perfect in its symbolism. The artist emperor who sees his city's destruction as raw material for his art, but perfect images are often suspect. The story comes to us through historians writing decades later, men who had their own reasons to portray Nero as a monster. Did it happen? Perhaps. Does it matter? The story tells us what Romans needed to believe about their emperor. Here we separate what is attested from what is attractive. The sources disagree. They carry bias, distance, and politics. We will not choose a single voice. We will listen to the chorus. Tacitus writes 50 years after the fire. Suetonius writes 60 years after. Dio writes 150 years after. Each brings different information, different prejudices, different purposes. Reading them together, We hear not one clear account, but a conversation across time historians, arguing with each other about what happened and what it meant. What we know for certain is that the fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights. We know that Nero returned from Antioch. We know he organized relief efforts. We know he began planning reconstruction before the ashes were cold. We know that rumors about his involvement began immediately and never stopped. Everything else is chorus voices, harmonizing and conflicting, creating a music that tells us as much about the listeners as about the song. Chapter 3. The SCAPGOAT. When a city hurts, it reaches for a cause it can touch. After the flames, the search narrows. A small sector verse, stubborn, unfamiliar, becomes legible to power. The Christians, in the charred districts, in the refugee camps, in the rebuilt neighborhoods where life slowly returned. People asked the same question: why did this happen to us? Natural disasters demand supernatural explanations. Random tragedies need responsible parties. The human mind, faced with chaos, reaches for patterns, for villains. For someone to blame, Christians in Rome were a small community, maybe a few thousand people in a city of over 1 million. They were not yet a church in any organized sense, more like a network of house gatherings. People who shared meals and stories about a teacher executed in Palestine decades before. They are not one voice. They are traders and slaves, widows and craftsmen, Jews and Gentiles, disputing with themselves as often as with the world. They meet in houses, borrow language of kingdoms and lords, refuse sacrifices to the gods most Romans call neighbors. This refusal made them suspicious. Romans were religiously tolerant, but their tolerance had limits. You could worship any god you liked, as long as you also paid respect to Rome's gods and the emperor's spirit. Christians wouldn't do this. They spoke of one God, one Lord, one kingdom. None of these were Roman. They also spoke strangely about fire. Their scriptures promised that the world would end in flames, that God would burn away the old creation to make room for the new. 2 neighbors already nervous about Christian oddness. This talk of divine fire took on new meaning after their city actually burned. Accusations attach, haters of humanity, incendiaries' words that make punishment feel like protection. Executions follow, gruesome, public, and persuasive for a season. The city is told, "This is why you suffered." According to Tacitus, Nero decided to deflect rumors about his own involvement by blaming the Christians. It was a calculated political move. Take the group that was already unpopular, already suspect, and make them responsible for the city's pain. The persecution that followed was brutal even by Roman standards. Christians were not simply executed, they were turned into entertainment. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were crucified. Still others were covered in pitch and burned alive as living torches to light. Nero's gardens at night, the cruelty had a purpose beyond punishment. It was theater designed to convince Romans that justice was being done, that the guilty were paying, that order was being restored. "Look," the executions said, "here are the people who hurt you. Watch them suffer as you have suffered." Some watched and believed justice was done. Some watched and felt a second fire take hold, one that consumes the idea of neighbors, but the strategy had unintended consequences. Many Romans, whatever they thought of Christian beliefs, were disturbed by the excessive cruelty of the punishments. Even Tacitus, no friend to Christians, wrote that people began to feel pity for them, believing they were being destroyed not for the public good but to satisfy one man's cruelty. The persecution created sympathy. It made Christians look like victims rather than villains. It suggested that maybe the emperor was more interested in putting on a show than finding the truth. We resist the tidy dark that makes Christians simply victims or Nero simply monster. Politics, fear, and convenience meet here. Scapegoats are chosen not for guilt, but for availability. The Christians who died in Nero's persecution were real people with real names, though most of those names are lost to us. They were not abstractions in a political game. They were bakers and weavers, mothers and merchants, people who had chosen to follow a teaching that promised them peace and cost them their lives. But they were also convenient, small enough to be manageable, strange enough to be plausible as villains, stubborn enough to make good examples. In the calculus of power, these qualities mattered more than guilt or innocence. Scapegoats are chosen not for what they have done, but for what they cannot do: fight back effectively, command sympathy, make their persecution too costly for their persecutors. The Christians of Rome in 64 CE fit these criteria perfectly. Chapter 4. A city Erebar fire writes quickly. Rebuilding writes the second draft. When the flames finally died, they left behind more than destruction. They left behind possibility. Acres of prime real estate, cleared of old buildings and older debts. Streets that could be planned rather than inherited. A chance to build the city that Rome had always meant to be. Wide streets appear measured, straighter, with setbacks to break the spread of future flames. Building materials shift toward stone. Porticos line the ways. Courtyards breathe. Rules harden. Shared walls, storage practices, eaves and walkways. Nero's building code, issued while the ashes were still warm, was remarkably progressive. Buildings could be no more than 70 feet tall. Streets must be at least 40 feet wide. The first story of every building must be made of stone, not wood. Buildings must have porticos to provide shade and firebreaks. Courtyards must be open to the sky. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were fire prevention, written in law. The new Rome would be beautiful, but more importantly, it would be safe. The rebuilding employed thousands of workers, stonemasons and carpenters, architects and laborers, artists and engineers. For many Romans, left homeless by the fire, reconstruction work provided both purpose and income. The city that had burned them gave them the means to rebuild it, and then there is the great house, the Domus Aurea, a palace cut from the city's wounded ground. Gold frescoes, artificial lake, rooms that turn with the sky. To some, a marvel. To many, a theft. The emperor's pleasure grown from public pain, while ordinary Romans crowded into temporary housing or newly built apartments that, however improved, were still apartments. Their emperor was building himself a palace that covered over 300 acres in the heart of the city. The Golden House was less a residence than a private city, complete with gardens, lakes, forests, and buildings that seemed to belong more to dreams than to architecture. The main dining room had a ceiling that rotated slowly, mimicking the movement of the heavens. The walls were covered in gold leaf and precious stones. There was a lake where the Colosseum now stands, surrounded by buildings designed to look like cities. The entrance hall contained a 120-foot statue of Nero himself, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It was breathtaking. It was also tone-deaf. A ruler can both relieve and overreach. Nero's Rome is safer by measure, and also more his. Progress and propaganda walked together. The improvements to Rome were real and lasting. The building codes prevented another fire on the same scale. The wider streets and stone construction made the city safer and more pleasant. The new forums and temples were genuine additions to civic life, but they came at the cost of making Rome feel more like Nero's personal project than the people's city. The Golden House, rising from land cleared by fire, suggested that maybe the emperor had benefited more from the disaster than he had suffered from it. Critics whispered that Nero had needed the fire to clear space for his palace. They pointed out that the Golden House occupied exactly the areas that had burned most completely. They noted that the emperor's own buildings had somehow escaped the flames that consumed everything around them. These observations led to a terrible question. Had Nero allowed the fire to burn, or even started it, in order to get the land he wanted for his building projects? We ask, does a safer plan absolve a ruler? Does beauty built after disaster cleanse its cause? Cities do not answer. They endure. The Golden House was built, lived in briefly, and then buried by Nero's successors, who wanted to erase any trace of his reign. The lake was filled in to build the Colosseum. The buildings were torn down or built over. The gardens became baths and forums. The palace that was supposed to immortalize Nero became his burial ground. But the street plan remained. The building codes remained. The improved infrastructure remained. Centuries after Nero's death, Romans still walked on streets widened after the fire, still lived in buildings built to his safety standards, still benefited from his urban planning. Night returns. Lamps relight. Somewhere a baker checks a door. The city exhales a little wiser, a little colder, still itself in the rebuilt districts. Life found its rhythm again. Shops reopened. Markets resumed. Children played in streets that were wider and safer than the ones their parents had known. The city that had burned was still Rome, but it was also something new, a city that had learned from its pain. The vigils walked their beats with better equipment and clearer procedures. Building inspectors checked construction with powers they had never had before. Citizens stored grain and oil with new awareness of how quickly comfort could become catastrophe. Rome had burned, and Rome had learned, and Rome endured. Epilogue and call to action. The great fire of Rome is not one story. It is ash and whispers, edicts and rumors, faith and fear. If you listen closely, the city is still speaking. Make room between your walls. Share water. Doubt easy villains. And when you rebuild, remember who must live inside what you plan. 2,000 years later, we still tell stories about those 6 days in July. We argue about what Nero did and didn't do, about whether he was villain or victim of circumstances beyond his control. We debate the treatment of Christians, the wisdom of his building codes, the beauty and excess of his Golden House. These arguments matter less than what they reveal about us. In the great fire of Rome, we see our own fears about power and responsibility, about how communities respond to crisis, about what happens when the center cannot hold. We see a city learning that safety is not accident but design. We see neighbors turned against neighbors by fear and rumor. We see leaders making choices that help and harm in equal measure. We see people rebuilding not just buildings but trust, not just streets but relationships. The fire burned for 6 days. Its lessons have burned for 2 millennia. In every city that faces disaster, in every community that must choose between fear and compassion, in every moment when we must decide whom to blame and whom to protect. The ghosts of that Roman summer whisper their warnings and their hopes. Fire forgets who owns what. But we remember, and we choose what to do with the remembering. What story from history challenged everything you thought you knew? Share it in the comments below. I'd love to explore it in a future video. And if this deep dive into Rome's darkest week intrigued you, hit that like button to help others discover these hidden historical truths. Subscribe for more stories, where we question the legends, examine the evidence, and let history speak for itself. Because sometimes the most important lesson isn't what happened, it's what we choose to believe happened. And why, for those still awake, our next journey takes us to Constantinople's night watch. For those drifting to sleep, may your city be quiet and your lamps be kind. Good night.